Right, welcome to day 2 of our webinar series on modern slavery. Today we're looking at the enablers. So we talked yesterday about policy, and today is about turning policy to reality. So how do we do that with the enablers? Just a quick reminder for those of you yesterday and for the newbies who are on the webinars. My name is Helen Carter. I'm the lead consultant for modern slavery and human rights and ethics in supply chains. And this is being brought to you by myself and my team. EJ, you will meet in a moment, Anna tomorrow, and Sam's supporting us as a researcher. The programme has been designed to go through sort of a mature approach to this. So we are starting yesterday with the easy way, and then obviously go into some more sophisticated concepts as we get through the week to some really interesting conversations on Friday. Action Sustainability or a consultancy, we've been working in this space now probably for the last 4 or 5 years. And you can see online here a mixture of our clients that range from training to due diligence. So a huge range of organisations that we've been helping over that time frame. So yeah, we had policy yesterday. Today is the enablers. You will see tomorrow the risk mapping and supply chain, myself on Thursday to go through procurement, and then finally a big conversation on how we bring modern slavery in an integrated approach with things like just transition, ESG. So an interesting one on Friday as well. But we will start with a really important subject. So EJ, if I can hand over to you to look after the enablers for us.
Hello, good morning. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I'm EJ. I'm a consultant at Action Sustainability, specialising in modern slavery, human rights, with some social value thrown in there as well. I'm also what they call sector lead for the construction market, which within the supply chain sustainability school. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We've got a couple of polls as we go through to get your engagement. I'm using something called Menti. So I'll be sharing that with you as we go through. It's really simple to use. You don't need to download any apps. Please use the Q&A function for any questions that you might have. We'll have some time at the end to look at those questions and go through them. So you'll find that the chat has been what's the word, disabled. You can't use the chat, but you can use the Q&A function. And if there are questions that you see somebody's put in and you're really keen for those questions to be asked, if you like them, it kind of sorts them out and they go up higher on the priority list. We're recording this session today and we'll be sharing all the slides with you. So hopefully that's good news. You don't need to sit back taking lots of notes. Okay, so enablers for due diligence, it's a huge topic, so we're just going to do a quick run through today, but hopefully it will provide you with some really practical tips and advice and help to get you all thinking and signposting to resources that can help. Mainly today it's focusing on an organisational perspective rather than a supply chain, simply because that's covered in more detail in tomorrow's webinar and the one on Thursday, although clearly the two are intrinsically linked. I suppose if you think about what we're talking about today in terms of your organisational approach, but that's the kind of approach you'd be looking to cascade down through your supply chain as well and embed into the kind of procurement process, but more about that in webinars later this week. So just to kind of start with a few stats, again, for those of you who were on the webinar yesterday, you would have already seen these, but there are just under 50 million victims. There were, sorry, just under 50 million victims on any day in 2021. Of the 28, and about 28 million of those victims are in forced labour globally, with the expectation about 24 million of them are exploited in the private sector, including in domestic work, construction, agriculture, and so on. So there's just some useful kind of stats there for you to look at and reflect on. When we're talking about modern slavery, it's this definition here on the bottom left-hand side, and it's the illegal exploitation of people for personal or commercial gain. It's where victims are trapped. They're trapped in servitude, which they were deceived or coerced into and cannot leave. So it's that when you're talking about modern slavery, it's the most extreme form of exploitation where victims may not be physically trapped with chains and so on, not chained up, but they feel trapped, and they're trapped because their exploiters are controlling them through methods such as threats to their family, to themselves, using violence, intimidation, isolation, withholding or controlling their passports, impersonating positions of authority, controlling bank accounts, and so on. And there's various different types of modern slavery mentioned here. So you've got sexual exploitation, forced labour, criminal exploitation, so that's where people are forced to beg or cultivate cannabis, or forced to pickpocket and things like that. And then you've got domestic servitude. I just want to dispel the myth right now that in the UK, all victims of modern slavery are migrants. So that's definitely not the case. You know, British people can be vulnerable and exploited and enslaved as well. It was over 1/3 of the victims identified through the UK's national referral mechanism in 2021 were British nationals. So just bear that in mind when we're thinking about due diligence and enablers today. And lastly, modern slavery it's prevalent. It's in nearly everything we buy. It's in phones, IT, cars, clothing, jewellery, construction, agriculture, cleaning products. And it's closer to home than we think. If you think about the UK, there's big risks in areas like car washes, agriculture, service sectors such as cleaning, security, agency workers, and so on. So I've stolen this slide here from CIOB, which looks at the exploitation spectrum in the construction sector. But you know, forget that it's got the construction label next to it, because I think it's similar for many different sectors. So the point here is that we saw nearly 50 million people in modern slavery, which is the most extreme form of exploitation. But imagine if we consider the total number of people being exploited, particularly around the left-hand side of this kind of wheel here, where you've got workers who are exploited, who are extremely vulnerable. And as they're exploited, the chance of them becoming victims of modern slavery increases. So we need to understand that relationship with exploitation and modern slavery. An example, I don't know if any of you saw the panorama a few weeks ago on the fast fashion company called Shein, S-H-E-I-N, however you pronounce it, I don't know, which talked about the exploitation of its workers in China working really long hours, having deductions of their pay, really poor health and safety and working conditions. And then a week or so later, there were then allegations that appeared in the news around modern slavery. So just be very aware of that link around exploitation makes people vulnerable, increases the chance of them becoming victims of modern slavery. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is grab your phone, or if you've got a new browser on your computer, and then go to menti.com. Okay, we did this yesterday, so some of you will be familiar. Menti.com, and then it will prompt you for a code. So the code to put in is there. I'm going to, if you're Billy or Helen, if you could pop that into the chat, that would be great. I'm just going to change my screen. But the code, here we go, let's present. You can see the code at the top there and the link, and it says, I want you to think about what words spring to mind when you hear the phrase due diligence in a modern slavery context. What do you think of? And it's all anonymous, we don't know who's written what. And if you're struggling with the tech, just please make a note in the Q&A, and Billy or Helen can help. But yeah, the web link's at the top, menti.com, and the code 390252. Brilliant. People are getting in there. Okay. Checking. Yes, absolutely. Risk analysis, whistleblowing. Oh, just I'm about to read something, it moves. Risk, yes. Audit, legislation, leadership, absolutely. This is great. Some of the enablers are coming up here already. Training, awareness, research, risk. Yeah, risk, I suppose the bigger the words are, the more of you have put those down. Information, accountability, be alert. Yes, absolutely. Audits, interesting that that's coming out as one of the most popular ones. Okay, great. So that's got some new thinking, and it's great to see that things like risk and checking and training are coming up really high there. You can carry on submitting your responses. I'm just going to go back to my slides. Okay, so I've got a few definitions here for you. What is due diligence? So I've got the Oxford English Dictionary definition there. So it's the reasonable steps taken by a person to avoid committing a tort or an offence. And then what I've included here is the definition from BS 25700, which is the new modern slavery standard, the British standard that looks at the organisational response to modern slavery. I would urge you to all have a look at that. I'll be referencing that throughout today. But it talks about, it's an ongoing risk management process. So well done to those of you who kept talking about risk. And it's a process to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how adverse impacts are addressed. So think about that. And then a phrase that I really like, that's stealing from Marshall's, Chris Harrop there, which is, it's about finding it and fixing it. What due diligence is definitely not about is confirmation of zero slaves. If organisations say they don't have any slaves in their business or their supply chain, it usually means they don't understand the complexities here, or they haven't looked, or they don't understand as well how clever exploiters are at infiltrating businesses. There's examples there on the top right here that I quite like. So Tony's Chocolatoni, they are very open about and transparent about their approach to acknowledging there is slavery within their supply chains, but this is how many cases they found, and this is what they're doing around remediation. So there's organisations that are slowly starting to become more accustomed to, actually, when we're talking about modern slavery, we need to be sharing examples of where we found it and the lessons learned there. You've got Fortescue Metals Company, who came out many years ago and said, we've searched our suppliers and we found slavery. Very open and transparent. And I think we'll start to see more businesses starting to do that. It's much bigger than a compliance issue. And I think very often there's a tendency for people to think, oh, it's a legal issue. It just sits with our legal department. It's a compliance issue. Just because you have a good policy or good processes in place, or if you pay good wages, it does not mean to say your organisation and your supply chain is okay and risk-free. Exploiters are so smart and highly adaptable, and they've proven that they can infiltrate organisations who are doing a lot to tackle this issue already. Okay, I'm not going to dwell too much on this slide, but it's just to signpost you to two different examples of human rights due diligence. So you've got the definition here from UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and what due diligence looks like. And you've got the one there on the right-hand side, the ETI Human Rights Due Diligence Framework. Useful resources for you to go away and have a look at. Yes, this is human rights, which is the umbrella term, I suppose, under which modern slavery fits. But the principles around due diligence are the same. So if you look on the right-hand side there, it's about assessing actual and potential human rights risks, about identifying leverage, responsibility and actions, mitigating that risk, remediation, and then monitor, review, report, improve, and so on. So do have a look at those. Why is this becoming so important? We touched on this in yesterday's session as well. Apart from it being the right thing to do, there's also this growing risk to reputation. There's some headlines here from organisations. You can see H&M, Biffa, the UK government, Hyundai, chocolate companies. IKEA were in the news last week or the week before around forced labour from prisons in Belarus. There's also an increase in civil litigation. So you've got Biffa there, for example, where it talks about 3 victims of trafficking and modern slavery to sue Biffa. You've got organisations like Mars, Nestle, who are facing child slavery lawsuits. And then you've got people like Google and Alphabet who are being sued by families of children working in the mining of conflict minerals. So this is all going on the background. There's new exposés pretty much every day. And then on top of you've got that drive from coming from ESG, from investors. Investors are definitely driving greater transparencies from companies on their ESG practices. Modern slavery is increasingly seen as just a core sustainable business risk, and investors are using ESG data on this to inform their investment decisions. From a legislative perspective, there's a big increase in due diligence legislation or legislative proposals. Just a few examples here, but there's a lot more out there. And whilst these are not in the UK, we have the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, but we do have international supply chains. So whilst the legislation might not directly impact our business, it will do when we start to think about the complex nature of our supply chains. So we haven't got enough time to look at the legislation today, but do go away and have a look at that. The top left there, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that's been approved by the EU Council is a really important one, where companies are required to disclose their impacts on the environment, human rights and social standards. So do go away and have a look at those. Okay, enablers. This is the main focus of why we're here today. So these are some of the enablers we're going to be touching on today. Just as a heads up, we're not going to look in too much detail at the procurement side of things, simply because this is going to be covered in the risk session tomorrow and the procurement session that Helen's delivering on Thursday. Okay, one of the first enablers, leadership and commitment. We talked a lot about this in the webinar yesterday, so have a reference back to that. You'll have all the links to all the webinars at the end of the week. We talked about the importance of leadership and commitment when developing a policy. And it's about, having that clear leadership at the highest level. So at board level, director level, when you read modern slavery policies, some organisations will have their chief sustainability officer on there, or director level. So that leadership at the top with a very kind of clear governance structure is imperative. And underneath that, you should have that kind of RACI matrix that some of you will be familiar with, that talks about who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and so on. And having internal policies that are interlinked with the good procedures that sit beneath these areas. It's a bit of a crude way of putting it, but, put your money where your mouth is. Increasingly, you hear organisations who they tell a good story around what they're doing, but actually, or what they plan to do, but actually when you talk to them, they don't really have the resource to actually do the work on this. So it's about being careful about allocating sufficient company resource to address the modern slavery risk. And there is a very clear business risk and business case here, as we've touched at, looking at ESG, reputation, and so on. Okay, understanding and identifying risk. Understanding the risks and being able to identify those is really important, because that will help inform a prioritised and a structured approach. You need to understand more about the risks and where the hotspots may lie. And again, Anna's going to be talking more about this tomorrow. But just to touch on this a little bit, when you're thinking about where the risks of modern slavery lie, think about where people might be vulnerable. So some of the hotspots could include things like where you've got migrant workers who potentially don't speak the language, don't understand their rights, don't understand how things work in other countries. It's a big risk there. Where you've got temporary or transient or seasonal labour, so things like agriculture or large construction projects like in Qatar that we've heard about, that's been in the news a lot around worker exploitation and modern slavery. Where you have low skilled or low pay jobs, or informal workers as well, where people might be on 0 hours contracts or have a lack of guaranteed hours. Think about contract and agency workers, it's a huge risk there. Women and children, other marginalised groups. And then also think about, there are certain industries or categories of spend that are known to be high risk. And again, I'm sure we'll talk about those later in the week. Some things like, conflict minerals, IT, construction materials, clothing, agriculture, and so on. So be aware of those, and that will help inform a prioritised approach. And when you're thinking about risk, think about your own business, your operations, and your supply chain, and also think about risk to people alongside risks to your business, which can be a challenge. So yes, and again, I'm sure we'll touch on that tomorrow. And also recognise that risks will change, and you need a process to manage this. Think how volatile supply chains are with these strong fluctuations in demand. Will buyers prioritise supply continuity over due diligence and compliance considerations? Yes, so we need to be aware of that and think about how risks change and how we manage that risk. So if we're thinking about international supply chains, again, this will be covered later on in the week more, but just to kind of reassure you now, there are lots of resources out there to help you learn more about where the risks may sit. So you've got there the TVPRA, I think it is, list of goods produced by child labour and forced labour. And then you've got the anti-slavery map there that looks at where the issues with different products and supply chains in different countries. Setting priorities. as I said, modern slavery is prevalent. When people who don't know much about it start to kind of do a bit of research, it can be overwhelming because it's prevalent, it's in pretty much everything. So you really need to understand you can't tackle everything, and you need to take a risk-based and prioritized approach. You know, you're in this for the long haul. Due to the complex nature of the challenges we face, there's no quick fix to this. And remember, your priorities will be determined by understanding where the risks lie, the impact of the risk, and your leverage, your capacity to influence change. And that's either as an organisation or through collaborating with others. Okay, recruitment. This is a big area. If you're thinking about in the UK, it's a heightened area of risk at the moment. We have a skill shortage, we have a labour shortage. What happens when you need people urgently to finish a project or get something done by a deadline? You know, do we ask more questions or less? Again, I think we know what the answer is there. There's lots of organisations who are thinking about international recruitment fairs. How are they going to get the workers they need? So this is so important, more so now than ever. So there's some kind of areas to just kind of some tips here to help you. Recruitment practices, they need to uphold a standard that protects workers from exploitative practices, and recruitment companies should be assessed and audited to understand what are they doing on this. And where you see things in contracts that could encourage vulnerabilities, get rid of them. Some of the issues around recruitment here, so recruitment fees, no one should have to pay for a job, and it's about making sure people haven't paid recruitment fees and that they haven't been hidden as well. Sometimes recruitment fees can be hidden as deductions from worker wages or forced onto workers as kind of optional services. So it's about being aware of that. Thinking about deductions, for those of you in the built environment sector, I often talk about Achilles, who have a report called the Ethical Employment Trends Report, and they found, I think it was last year, that 17% of their work, 17% of workers on their client sites surveyed had been deducted up to 25% of their weekly wage via a range of completely unexpected deductions, and that took some of them below the legal minimum wage. So just be aware of that. Interviews. Think about where people are being interviewed, how people are being interviewed. Are you seeing them face to face? Do the people who are conducting the interviews, do they know how to spot the signs of modern slavery? Have they been trained? Do they have the soft skills there around that? Also thinking about interpreters. There's a report that you can have a look at that looks at the findings from Operation 4, which is one of the biggest UK kind of modern slavery cases in the UK. And one of the examples they talk about is how the exploiters had infiltrated an employment agency through interpreters. So there's a risk area there. If somebody doesn't speak the language, they're vulnerable. You know, so think about that and how you can manage that and reduce the risk. Do workers understand their rights? Can't emphasize enough how important that is. When you're thinking about migrant workers, vulnerable people who are desperate for a job, they might not understand their rights. They probably don't think it matters. They just want a job. But more on this in a moment. Employment contracts, again, probably stating the obvious here, but making sure people see them before the work begins, that they're in a language that the worker understands. You know, how often are employment contracts issued and the worker probably doesn't really you know, they don't know what the content is because they don't speak the language, and the importance of providing that accurate reflection on the work that's being undertaken. And again, thinking about the approach your contractors, agencies and subcontractors should implement, a similar within their operations and supply chains, should be replicating what we're talking about now. So if you're thinking about terms and conditions, I'm not going to go into detail here. There's a good checklist here, you know, but entitlements, what's included, what's not. Freedom of association, that's a big one, especially in international supply chains. It's quite difficult to find good examples of companies taking specific actions in relation to ensuring workers' rights to unionize and collective bargaining. That piece around access to remedy and grievance, do people know what they can do and what access to remedy there is? And also ensuring understanding around 0 hours contracts. So there's a link here to ACAS, which has all the information you could need around that. The only other thing that's not on here, I'm thinking, is thinking about right to work checks as well. Make sure that people conducting the right to work checks know how to spot the signs of modern slavery as well. Okay, we've got another Menti poll. So let's change the screen again. Oh, no, go back, giving you all the answers. So I'm going to go to the next question here. So who needs to be trained on modern slavery? Who needs to know about it? Who needs to be trained and aware? Oh, some people are quick there. Everyone. I love it. Brilliant. Legislation, our employees, third parties, managers. Yes, these are all good. Keep them coming. Everyone seems to be the most common response, which is great. HR team, procurement. Yeah, what kind of job roles are really important? What do we think? Interviewers, yes, we just talked about that. Purchasing team. Human resources, frontline staff, absolutely. Brilliant. Risk. What other ones have we got on there? Recruitment, audit, she teams, subcontractors. Great. That's it. You're all busy submitting your responses. They're site operatives. Absolutely. Okay. Carry on submitting your thoughts there, but I'm just going to go back to my slides. Okay. So what we've got here is just an example of the different types of knowledge that's required, what that looks like for different audiences, and then a bit on the how, so different formats. This is by no means all encompassing. This is just to get you thinking. But the main thing is it's different methods of training and awareness for different people. It's all about communication and ensuring that the message is communicated in a way that can be understood and is relatable to the recipient. So think about language, think about cultural differences that could potentially constrain conversations with suppliers in different countries. Examples here, I'm not going to go through all of these, but at the top line there, what is modern slavery and how to spot the signs? That's a huge one. If you can get that sorted, then that's a great first step. If people know what it is and how to spot the signs, and most importantly, what to do if they do spot the signs, more about that a bit later. And that's for everybody, especially where you've got people who are working frontline with operatives, and there's lots of different ways to communicate that. So things like posters, social media, meetings, inductions, having that in everybody's inductions. And there are loads of free resources out there, especially videos that are quite powerful. And there's lots of different languages as well. Again, more about that a bit later on. So when you think about when you're training specific audiences, whether it's procurement or senior management, then you need to have that workshop approach. It's smaller numbers, opportunities for discussion in specialist areas, getting people enthused and actually feeling empowered. Right, I understand this issue now and I recognize what my role is in tackling this. That's so important, so that it doesn't just feel like it's going through the motions, because actually they think it's a compliance issue or something like that. The last one there, worker empowerment. This is huge. I'll keep coming back to this. And think about different ways of communicating. So for worker empowerment, you can think about videos. There are mobile apps, inductions. What I've not talked about as well is stakeholder engagement and knowledge sharing forums. Modern slavery is an area where people need to be collaborating and learning from each other. And it's about, like I said, empowering everyone and emphasizing their role in the bigger picture and how they can make a difference. Some of the resources that I find really useful are the videos out there from survivors, which talk about their experience. That can be really impactful and make people realize, oh, I get this now. We're talking about people. It's not just a compliance kind of tick box issue. If you're running training sessions for internal teams, think about, well, could you invite the supply chain to join? The team Action Sustainability, we've delivered lots of training within different sectors, and very often it will be with a house builder and their supply chain who are high risk, with a main contractor and a supply chain. It's about being really collaborative and highlighting to your supply chain that this is a difficult issue and you all need to work collaboratively and build that trust. And it's thinking about refresher training as well. Don't just have one session and that's it. Things change, risks change. People need to be reminded of what's happening here and what the organisation is doing to tackle modern slavery. And yes, when you have categories of spend considered high risk of modern slavery, again, think about embedding this same approach, embedding these kind of training requirements through the procurement process. And again, Helen will be touching on that, I'm sure, and Anna later on in the week. So here are some resources that can help when we're talking about things like worker empowerment. When workers don't know their rights or understand their entitlements, they become vulnerable and perfect targets for exploiters. There are the GLAA, the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority, has some brilliant resources in different formats that you can download, and they're available in different languages. So do have a look at those. The workers' rights leaflets are available in 21 languages. You've got you've got the workers' checklist there. So your rights as a worker in the UK with QR codes. And think about actually chatting to one of somebody from HS2 Old Oak Common who works on that programme, and he said, you know, we're talking about making sure that we're putting these posters in places that, you know, kind of in toilets and places like that, so that people don't feel that there's eyes on them watching them kind of looking at the QR codes or reading these posters. It's about putting them in places where people feel comfortable to look at them. So have a think about that as well. You've got the Just Good Work app there. That's an example of the use of mobile technology and an app, which the Just Good Work app, it gives job seekers and workers kind of key information and advice for things that they need on their kind of, I suppose, journey to work. So from recruitment to employment to life in a new destination, all to kind of moving on to a different job or returning home. You've got the Ethical Trading Initiative, which have resources around country-specific programs that work on giving workers a stronger voice. For example, in Bangladesh, there are interventions there to help garment workers have a voice. And just thinking what else. And then also there's on the bottom right there, you can see, I think that's the UK government has produced a new poster or leaflet that anybody can download in different languages for people who think they may be a victim of modern slavery, and it reassures them around actually how do they know they're a victim of modern slavery and what kind of support is offered through them, and that they're not to fear going to the police and so on. And there's implications of not addressing these issues, of not kind of taking this seriously. Last week there was deemed as a revolt at the world's largest iPhone factory in China. You may have read that the workers there decided to leave the plant because of delayed payments and poor conditions caused by China's zero COVID policy. So, you know, you need to be doing this for several reasons. And then you've got some leaflets there about workers' rights in other countries. So there's lots of resource out there. Yes, some more examples of resources. I mean, there's so much. I'm just trying to kind of get signposting you, reassuring you that there are things out there. If you're working in the built environment, we have the Supply Chain Sustainability School. So we've got 180 main contractors, big infrastructure companies, house builders, FM service providers, who are all backing the school. And within the school, there's all sorts of resources. There's procurement guidance on how to embed best practice procurement when combating modern slavery that Action Sustainability developed with the school's partners. You've got the learning pathways there, which are a curriculum of resources for an introduction to modern slavery, setting up your site to combat modern slavery, due diligence checklists. They're all free. You've got guidance there on right to work and what best practice looks like there, linking into, you know, the modern slavery, human rights and right to work. And you've got the British standard again, BS 25700. So just, yes, there are lots of resources out there. Stakeholders. So lots of these organizations here have free resources that you can use, especially around the whole kind of comms piece. So there's posters, videos, templates. Do go and have a look, because there's a lot there. You don't need to start from scratch on all of this. It's a lot of resource there. I would say get involved in knowledge sharing forums where you can. It's really important to share and work collaboratively, whether it's through peer groups, industry sector groups, potentially having your own networks within your own organisation. I know that marshals have their own kind of modern slavery ambassadors, and a modern slavery ambassador group. Think about NGOs, unions. There's a lot of stakeholders out there once you start looking, and also understand the wider stakeholders and communicate with all of them. So, you know, your stakeholders, it's your shareholders, your investors, your supply chain, your customers, your employees, workers throughout the supply chain. Just be aware that there's not a, so looking at some of the logos here, understand where the support, what kind of support you need, because there's no kind of one-stop shop for everything. There'll be areas of expertise in different organisations. So stating the obvious, but just be aware of where it is you need the support. Okay, grievance and remediation. I'm gonna have a drink because this is a big chunky topic. So the grievance piece. So I saw a statistic earlier this week that was from a survey earlier this year conducted by a company called Zappi in partnership with many anti-slavery charities. And it found that, oh dear, voice is going. It found that more than half of adults in the UK think they've spotted a victim of modern slavery, but only 1 in 3 of them had raised concerns. People tend not to raise concerns because they think, oh, it was a gut instinct. I saw something, it didn't quite look or feel right, but you know, I'm not really sure. I don't want to cause any trouble. Or they might think something really isn't right there, but I don't know what to do. I don't know who to call. So knowing what the signs of modern slavery are, but also knowing if you spot something, what do you do, is so important. So think about making sure your own employees understand what to do. And also whether, if you have with things like whistleblowing helplines, could you offer those out to your supply chain as well? Again, thinking about putting posters in places like toilets where people can look at them in detail and not worry about others watching them. And I would say make sure there's multiple routes to raise concerns or complaints. What you'll find is that very often victims are, or employees in general, are a bit nervous sometimes about your own internal helpline, and they might feel more comfortable just going to a generic kind of, you know, hotline or anonymous external helpline. Others may be more comfortable talking to, say, a grievance officer within your business, or a line manager, but make sure there's multiple routes to raise concerns. People need to know as well what to do if you're approached by someone who thinks they may be a victim, which is a rare occurrence, but about being aware of the practicalities of managing potential victims, and thinking about, you know, having, you know, knowing to signpost to a translation service, having that ready should you need that service there. Think about, for the victims themselves, it's about having that same approach. So having those awareness campaigns to help them recognize, first of all, to recognize that they're a victim, or if they think they're being exploited. One of the big challenges here is that victims of modern slavery don't always can see themselves as a victim, and they're scared to speak out. So they may have been told by their exploiters that if they speak out, they're going to be put in prison, or their family may be hurt, or so on. And then another useful tip from Sky, they'd been on one of their projects for Skylab. Sky found that they did some lessons learned around worker engagement, and they found that modern slavery terminology doesn't resonate well with construction workers, especially when there's not much context or explanation given on posters or in induction. So in some cases, actually thinking about and understanding, is it better to avoid the use of words like slavery, and talk about labour exploitation and labour rights. It feels a bit more accessible because some people wouldn't characterise themselves as a slave. So just think about languages as well. It's about thinking, if you find slavery in your supply chain, what do you do? The big question. Best practice advocates not to just boycott the supplier and cut off ties with the organisation. If it's not fundamental to the contract and therefore an immediate breach, can you work with the supplier to understand, well, why has this happened, and work with them, kind of engage with them to try to understand how you can improve their systems, prevent this happening again. Try to work together to build trust, to encourage them to flag issues and work towards that kind of continuous improvement. It's about ensuring workers have a voice and focus on worker empowerment and prevention, and collaboration is absolutely key again on this. Collaborating with other stakeholders, peers, competitors, especially around establishing kind of forms of remedy, whether it's to help with legal representation or to correct any kind of adverse impacts. So moving on to the right hand side here, thinking about remediation, how far will you go? How much support are you willing to offer, or can you offer? So in the UK, is it a case of, well, you know, they've been put in touch with law enforcement, they're going through the national referral mechanism. Is that it? Can you do more? It's a complex issue. Victims of modern slavery or survivors will have suffered significant trauma from their experience. You know, they'll be suffering from PTSD very often. So can you support them in their rehab? Can you look at ways to help them with employment? Do you have any partnership agreements with NGOs like the Salvation Army? Can you engage with the victims to understand, well, how did this come about? Try to understand the root cause and rectify the issue that caused the problem in the first place. Things like paying back recruitment fees. If you find that recruitment fees or deductions have been made in the supply chain, how will you make sure that the fees are paid back? If you're an SME, this can feel like a huge challenge, and you know, you might not be able to provide financial support, but could you kind of somehow work with charities like Bright Future and Causeway, which we'll have a look at in a moment. It's a huge topic. I would urge you to have a look at pages, I think it's 35 to 40 within the British Standard. It covers this off really thoroughly. There's not enough kind of time to do it justice today. And there's a case study here, Bright Future. This was developed by Causeway as a partnership with the Co-op in 2017. You may have heard about this. And it was a way of fast-tracking survivors of modern slavery into secure employment. And it became its own cooperative, I think, in 2019. So it's members of the businesses who provide the job opportunities and placements, and the charities who refer survivors into the programme. So it's that kind of matchmaking. Previously, Causeway, which were previously City Hearts, they provide services to prevent the re-exploitation of survivors. So it's thinking about that as well, and protecting them when they recover and supporting their progression back into what their lives would have looked like if they hadn't become victims. So I would urge you to have a read about the work they do. And they have a survivor of modern slavery as one of their trustees. Okay, I think, yeah, we're nearly there. We'll be taking questions in a moment. So here are some examples of some remediation policies you can have a look at. There is a template here from Stronger Together for a template remediation policy. Do have a look at that. And again, the British Standard BS 25700 in big red letters there. Pages 35 to 40, there you go. Do have a look at that, because this is an area that is so often forgotten or enough attention is not given on this. Okay, measurement and reporting. I'm going to just use an example here from Marshall's that I quite like. And I'm sure when we get into thinking about measurement and reporting in the supply chain, that will be talked about by Helen on Thursday as well. So an example here, Marshall's have got different ways of looking at measurement and reporting. So here we're looking at internal awareness, so thinking about training, inductions, increasing the number of modern slavery ambassadors within the business. Then you've got thinking about supplier communication, so how many organisations are accepting the code of conduct, development of education partnerships with high-risk suppliers. You've got proactive education programmes with suppliers who raise concerns or issues. Let's move on. And then we've got things around looking at partnership working around remediation and support for victims, like we just talked about. And about having a process in place. So they've said for 50% of supply chain identified as high risk by volume of product. You've got here going back again. Yeah, and you've got publishing of risk mapping for 50% of high risk supply chain. And then you've got the piece around external ethical auditing and modern slavery risk mapping program to cover 30% of supply chain identified as high risk. So those are just some examples to get you thinking. But if you're thinking about your own business, training and awareness is a really good place to start. So thinking about percentage of workforce attendees attending training and so on. And thinking about your supply chain, you know, the number of subcontractors with grievance mechanisms in place and so on. But that will be touched on much later on this week. Oh, there was another one there. Sorry, missed that one. So I think that's been a very quick run through. So hopefully that's been helpful. But yes, I'd like to open that up into questions. I'm going to have a look. I'm going to stop sharing. Helen, that's great. You've got your camera on. Can have a look at the Q&A. Okay. All right, let's have a look. Okay, any tips on how to ensure interpreters are authentic? Is there a standard we should seek? It's a really good question. And I don't know. It's something I can look into. I don't know if, Helen, you know anything on that. I suppose there's your usual due diligence checks that you can go through when you're employing anybody. But other than that, I don't know anything specific to interpreters.
No, there's no standard that I know of, but we can go and have a look at that. But one thing you can do is there are organisations that actually deal with law enforcement and deal with the NHS and deal with those where they are actually supporting crisis service. So if you look for interpreter service agencies, find those sorts of organisations. And in fact, Jana at the bottom has just done one, so you might want to reference that in a minute. It's doing a bit of research, and like he just said, due diligence, just do your checks on expertise. Some really good guides on how to employ interpreters as well, not just the ability to speak the language, but to understand the message that you're trying to get across, so that they can actually ensure that nothing's misinterpreted or important messages are given areas. But yeah, EJ.
No, that's great, Jana. I can see that we've had Jana who said they were an NRPSI interpreter for a decade, so they can advise. So there you go. Feel free to share contact details there. And Jana, if you have any tips to share, we can share them when we send out the slides and recording of today. Maria, so you've asked, how do we find out about forums external to our organisation? So that's great. So it's thinking about those opportunities to collaborate. So you're setting up one internally, but it'd be good to be part of some external ones. And Maria, what sector, could you just pop in the chat what sector that you're in? And then what could I ask, actually, if you're everybody else on the call today, if there are forums that you're involved in or know of, why don't you pop those in the chat as well and talk about what sector they are on the name, and then that will help facilitate some knowledge sharing. And Maria, if you tell us which sector you're in, we can go away and have a look and try to get back to you with some examples. I don't know if there are any that you want to reference in particular. I mean, there's so many. It's kind of known. Sorry, Helen.
I was going to say, Maria's just put IT consultancy. Maria, on Thursday, we're going to go through some of the things that are happening in different industries, but IT in itself has got quite a lot going on in this space. So there's some really good reports that we'll reference in the Thursday bit around the supply chain. And I don't think there's collaborations as such that you can join, maybe in that sort of services environment. Obviously the likes of the IBMs and the Dells and stuff are doing some work around OECD, conflict minerals, those sorts of initiatives. But there are organisations, for example, like Electronics Watch, and I'll be putting a bit more information into that on Thursday. So hopefully that will help. But we can go and have a look at IT as well and see if there's anything else that we're aware of.
Brilliant, thanks, Helen. And then somebody said they've recently moved from retail to construction and finding it a whole different ballgame. Yes, that's one way of putting it. Probably quite terrified. I wonder how long you'll stay there. Could you signpost any collaborative groups for the built environment? Yes, so something I mentioned earlier on is that I kind of lead the construction market within the supply chain sustainability school. So that's a collaboration of 180 contractors, clients, infrastructure companies, house builders, FM service providers. And it's an online virtual learning platform that provides free resources to anyone. Anyone can go in and use them. And we have a group that looks at labour and people issues. So that's our partners are represented on that group. And they've recently agreed, actually, we're going to refocus in just on modern slavery and exploitation. So that's something I can certainly help with. Interested to know which business you work for, but you'll have my contact details on the last slide. So do contact us because I can signpost you to the school. What we're trying to look at is what resources do we have? Where are the gaps? Where does the industry really need new support? And most importantly, where are the opportunities to collaborate to drive almost like a kind of common approach through the supply chain? Anything else on that one, Helen?
Only that there are small other groups. So like utilities has one that we I'm with EJ in the school as well. We link in with the Utilities Against Slavery initiative. I can see Mark's on the call. He's doing work with some big projects like Scape. So you will find little subgroups as well that are dotted around. The GLAA has contacts into the construction environment. So one of the things we do at the school is we try and not reinvent, and we will signpost you to all the different initiatives, but it does depend where in the built environment you're working. So if you use the links that EJ circulates around for the supply chain school, that will give you a really good place to start.
Okay, great. Thanks, Helen. Tracy has asked, is Causeway a national organisation? Yes, it is. And I'll make sure we include details when we send out the information. But are there similar organisations we could look at? I'm sure there will be. I don't know the names of them to hand. But again, if anybody else on the call today, those organisations that are doing things on this, please do pop links into the chat. Helen, are there any others that spring to mind? I mean, the Salvation Army, there's a lot that provide, you know, like Salvation Army, and now I've gone blank. Who are the others, Helen?
Yeah, people like the Salvation Army. There are organisations like Hope for Justice, etc., that do work with victim support, but all their offerings are slightly different. So again, it's think about what you're looking for. Causeway are a good organisation to go to. They have created this employment model, but it is, a lot of the charities will make sure that individuals get the help first before they even think about the employment, to make sure that they obviously deal with the trauma, get housing, get support. If they're in the UK, have they got everything they're entitled to? If they're an immigrant that are coming in, can they go for asylum? Those sorts of issues. So yeah, EJ's right. Salvation Army are a good one to go and have a look at. People like Hope for Justice, Stop the Traffic. All of these sorts of organisations deal with victims as well, but the employment ones, I think Causeway are the ones that we've seen the most of on that, EJ.
Yeah. And then Maria, question linking to, yes, a huge challenge. So companies that don't make something don't have the weight or the leverage, I guess, to demand visibility through all tiers of the supply chain. What do we do? This is a huge challenge. Helen, I'm going to go to you on that one, as you're running the procurement.
I was going to say the answer's come and see me on Thursday, because that's exactly what I'm going to go through. On Thursday, we're going to talk procurement strategies. So at the risk of slightly hijacking EJ's session, we'll do a bit of a plug, because the reality is, Maria, if you are a provision of providing services, your impact is going to be different to an IBM or a Dell. So what we're going to go through on Thursday is where you are in the supply chain, what your influence looks like, and what does that look like in terms of a procurement strategy. And funnily enough, there's not one size fits all. So I will make sure that we've got some stuff in there for you, Maria, on IT as well. That's one of the common areas. We've got built environment and we've got garments and manufacturing. So that will be in Thursday. The good news is you're not expected to go and audit everything. We'll give you some other solutions to have a look at as well.
Great. Maria said she'll be there on Thursday listening avidly. So that's good to hear. So I'm looking, I think I can't see any more questions. So does anyone else have anything else? Or if you spotted one, Helen, sorry.
I've just seen a note, Jana. Yes, thank you, Jana. You can tell my brain's not working very well, and yeah, these things can be quite tiring. Unseen, completely forgot those guys. So one of the things I think was on the slides was the Modern Slavery Helplines. We've talked a lot about GLAA. They have a huge role to play in this, but Unseen do some amazing work in this space in terms of dealing with victims. So if you use a Modern Slavery Helpline as a way to report any suspicions, one of the key things that you can find here is that they have interfaces with law enforcement, with charities that can support victims. So they actually pull everything together, helping with the prosecution and helping with the support in that space. So yeah, they're on the bottom of that list. They're one that I very strongly recommend going and having a look at. Unseen help with that as well. So yes, apologies, Jana, you're very right. We completely forgot them, and they are a really good organisation to deal with.
Yeah, sorry. So I just that was some of the the stakeholders we talked about. So Unseen are on there. But yeah, no, very good point. Thank you. Okay, I think that's it. I can't see any more questions. Or if I missed anything, Helen, shout out if anything appeared in the last minute.
Can't see anything.
No.
I think the key thing here is that from an organisational perspective, everything that EJ's gone through today is what we're going to talk about how you address in supply chains as well. So the structure here today is don't forget your own organisation before you jump into the supply chain as well. Lots of organisations go straight to the supply chain and forget themselves and forget what they do. So yeah, it's a good place to start.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you, everybody. Great to see so many of you here today as well. Please do get in touch if you have any questions or you'd like some support from the team, and hopefully you'll be joining the sessions for later on in this week. We'll be sending out the slides probably at the end of the week with the recordings and so on. So thank you. Thanks for your time, and hopefully see you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.